They laughed at the tunnel long before the snow arrived. The widow noticed it first in the way people paused when they passed her property, in the way conversations lowered when she walked into the supply store, in the way eyes followed her hands when she bought canvas instead of firewood, rope instead of extra food. She lived on the ridge above the valley, far enough to be inconvenient, close enough to be watched. After her husband died, people had expected her to leave. When she didn't, they decided she wouldn't last. She lived alone with her daughter and an old shepherd mix that limped when the weather changed. The house was small, weathered, and solid in the way old things become when they've survived enough winters to know their place. The ridge caught wind differently than the valley. Storms climbed it, tested it first, then spilled downward with whatever strength remained. Anyone who lived there learned quickly to respect silence, because silence was usually the warning. Late autumn came early that year. The mornings carried a metallic smell, sharp and cold, the kind that made breath visible even when the sun was out. Leaves didn't fall so much as surrender, clinging until frost turned them brittle overnight. The widow felt it in her bones. Winter wasn't just coming. It was arriving with intention. That was when she began building the tunnel. At first it looked like nothing worth noticing. A few poles driven into the ground. Canvas laid out in the yard. Rope measured, cut, and coiled with care. Then the shape emerged. Low, narrow, hugging the earth like something ashamed to be seen. It ran from the front door of the house to the small utility shed a short distance away, bending slightly as if avoiding attention. People assumed it was temporary, some kind of half-finished shelter. But days passed, and the structure grew more deliberate. Anchors were sunk deeper. The canvas was layered, angled to deflect wind rather than resist it. The tunnel wasn't tall enough to walk through. Anyone using it would have to crouch or crawl. That was when the comments started. Why would anyone build something you can't even stand up in? Looks like a burial shroud. She's lost her mind up there. The men in the valley were practical people, at least by their own definition. They stacked supplies the way their fathers had. They trusted sightlines and memory. They believed knowing where something was mattered more than how to reach it. When they saw the widow crawling through her yard like an animal, they laughed openly. Her daughter heard it first. "Why are they laughing?" she asked one evening, watching from the window as two neighbors passed on horseback. The widow didn't answer right away. She tightened a knot, tested it with her weight, then wiped her hands on her coat. "Because they think standing up means being safe," she said finally. The child didn't understand, but she nodded anyway. The dog understood more than either of them. He stayed close while the tunnel took shape, circling it, sniffing the canvas, settling near the entrance as if it already belonged to him. Animals learned early what humans insisted on discovering the hard way. By the time the first hard frost locked the ground, the tunnel was complete. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't strong in the way people recognized strength. It didn't promise warmth or food or shelter in the traditional sense. It promised something less visible and far more valuable: certainty. Inside the tunnel, the world narrowed. Sound softened. Wind slid overhead instead of tearing at skin. The ground stayed dry, protected by the simple fact that snow, when denied a place to settle, lost much of its power. The widow moved through it every morning, sometimes crawling, sometimes crouching, always keeping one hand on the fabric. Her daughter followed, turning it into a game. The dog followed last, patient and watchful. The valley kept laughing. Winter forecasts began to circulate, carried by radio and rumor. A long season, heavy snow, strong winds. Nothing unheard of. Nothing people felt the need to prepare for differently. They reinforced windows, checked generators, cleared paths between doors and sheds, relying on memory and muscle. The widow did something else. She marked the inside of the tunnel with knots in the rope supports. One near the door, one at the bend, one before the exit. Simple markers, unmissable by touch. Even a child could count them. Even in darkness. Even in panic. Her daughter noticed. "What are those for?" she asked. So you always know where you are, the widow replied. The girl ran her fingers over the knots, smiling. Even if I can't see? Especially if you can't see. That was the sentence that lingered. The first snow arrived quietly. A dusting. Pretty enough for children to celebrate and adults to dismiss. The valley softened under white, and laughter followed the widow up the ridge again. Then the wind came. Not all at once, not dramatically. It arrived in shifts, testing angles, finding weaknesses, learning the terrain like a living thing. Snow began to move sideways. Visibility shrank. Familiar distances grew uncertain. The radio warned of a system stalling over the region. A blizzard. Prolonged. Dangerous. Still, people went about their routines. The widow stopped leaving the ridge. She brought everything inside the tunnel's reach. Food, water, tools. She moved slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush even as the sky darkened earlier each afternoon. Panic wasted energy. Speed invited mistakes. On the night the storm truly arrived, the sound woke her. The house groaned as if adjusting to a new weight. Wind pressed against the walls, not howling but pushing, relentless and focused. Snow rattled against the windows like thrown gravel. The world outside vanished into noise. The daughter climbed into her bed without being called. The dog lay across the doorway, ears alert, body still. The widow listened. This wasn't a storm that passed. This was a storm that stayed. By morning, the ridge no longer existed as a visible place. It was an idea buried under white. The valley below disappeared completely. Houses became shapes, then shadows, then nothing at all. Inside the tunnel, everything remained the same. The widow crawled through it slowly, checking tension, brushing snow from the entrance, reinforcing stakes where the wind had tested them hardest. The canvas snapped and strained, but it held, bending instead of breaking. She counted the knots without thinking. 1, 2, 3. Back inside, the radio crackled weakly, voices overlapping, panic leaking through the static. Reports of whiteout conditions, zero visibility. People advised to stay indoors. Some didn't listen. By midday, the first knock came from down the ridge. Not at her door, but carried by the wind. Someone shouting a name. Then silence. Then shouting again, farther away. The widow closed her eyes. She knew what that sound meant. When visibility disappears, the human mind betrays itself. Direction collapses. Distance lies. The body insists on standing upright, on moving faster, on fighting what cannot be fought. People walked straight lines and ended up circling their own homes until exhaustion dragged them into the snow. The valley began to lose people. No announcements. No alarms. Just absence. The daughter asked if school would open again. The widow told her stories instead. Stories about animals that survived storms by staying low, by trusting paths they could feel instead of see. The girl listened, fingers twisting in the dog's fur. Night came early and stayed. The wind grew louder, angrier. Snow piled against the tunnel's sides, but slid away as fast as it gathered. Inside, the air remained calm enough to breathe easily. The widow slept in short shifts, waking often, listening. That was when she heard the voice. Not close, not clear, but human. She moved instantly. Dropping to the floor, she crawled into the tunnel, heart pounding but movements controlled. At the opening, she paused, anchoring one hand firmly to the canvas. The other reached outward, fingers numb within seconds. She didn't step into the storm. She didn't stand. She called out low and steady, projecting direction rather than volume. "Get down," she said. "You're close. Crawl toward my voice." The answer came back broken, panicked. "I can't see. I can't." "Don't stand," she repeated. "Don't walk. Crawl." Minutes stretched. The wind tried to tear sound apart. Then a shape emerged from the white, collapsing near the tunnel entrance, shaking violently. The widow grabbed his coat, pulled him inward inch by inch, never letting go of the anchor behind her. Inside the tunnel, the man broke. He kept repeating the same sentence. "I was right there. I was right there." She didn't correct him. Inside the house, wrapped in blankets, he stared at the tunnel entrance like it was a miracle he didn't deserve. By morning, others were missing. The valley fell silent, not from peace, but from fear. People stopped shouting, stopped searching. They waited. Up on the ridge, the tunnel remained. The widow reinforced it again, hands raw, face stinging with cold. Her daughter helped, counting knots, learning the path by heart. The dog refused to leave the entrance. The storm showed no sign of ending, and the laughter never came back. The storm did not end. It paused. That pause was more dangerous than the wind itself because it convinced people that the worst had passed. The sound softened. The pressure against walls eased just enough to allow hope to return. Snow still fell, but now it drifted instead of striking. The world outside looked almost calm, if you ignored the way everything familiar had been erased. In the valley, doors opened. Men stepped out cautiously, boots sinking into snow that hid its depth well. They counted steps the way they always had, trusting memory more than evidence. A shed was only 30 paces away. A neighbor's house was just beyond the fence. They believed distance still obeyed rules. It didn't. Snow covered landmarks evenly. Fences vanished. Paths dissolved. The horizon blended into the ground until there was no up or down, no forward or back. People walked with confidence for a few seconds, then slowed. They turned, thinking they had drifted. Each correction sent them farther from where they started. The storm resumed without warning. Wind returned like a verdict. Visibility collapsed to nothing. Shouts were swallowed instantly. Panic erased logic, and logic was the only thing that could have saved them. On the ridge, the widow never opened the door. She had lived long enough with grief to recognize false calm. She stayed inside the house and listened, counting seconds between gusts, reading the storm the way others read clocks. Her daughter sat near her, quiet now, no longer playing games in the tunnel. Even children knew when the world had become dangerous. The dog growled low in his chest, sensing movement beyond sound. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was weak, almost apologetic, like someone unsure they deserved to be answered. The widow moved instantly. She slid into the tunnel, keeping low, breath steady. Snow clawed at the opening, but the canvas held, flexing inward without tearing. She anchored one knee, one hand, and called out. "Stay down," she said. "Don't move unless you hear my voice." A reply came, barely audible. Someone was close. Too close to be alive much longer without help. She reached out again, blind, fingers brushing fabric, then skin. Another person collapsed into the entrance, sobbing uncontrollably, body shaking so violently it took both of her arms to pull them fully inside. It was a woman from the valley, someone who had laughed. Inside the house, wrapped in blankets, the woman stared at the tunnel like it was a living thing. "I couldn't tell where I was," she whispered. "Everything looked the same." The widow nodded. "That's how storms work." Word spread again, not through conversation, but through survival. When the wind paused, people remembered the ridge. They remembered the strange structure they had mocked. They remembered the widow who hadn't laughed back. By the next pause, 3 figures appeared near the base of the ridge, crawling rather than walking, clinging to the ground like insects. They had learned the lesson the hard way. The widow didn't scold them. She didn't hesitate. She crawled into the tunnel again and again, voice hoarse, body aching, anchoring herself so others wouldn't vanish. The tunnel became a mouth, swallowing the lost and returning them alive. Not all made it. Some voices faded before she could reach them. Some shapes never emerged from the white. The storm did not bargain. It did not care about regret. Inside the house, her daughter helped where she could. She fetched blankets. She counted knots for those too shaken to do it themselves. She held the dog when his growls turned to whines. "Why didn't they listen?" she asked once. The widow didn't answer right away. "Because listening requires believing you might be wrong," she said finally. Days blurred together. Time lost meaning. The storm lingered, relentless, reshaping the valley inch by inch. Snow pressed against roofs. Ice crept into cracks. Supplies dwindled. People huddled in unfamiliar houses, too afraid to return to their own. The ridge became a refuge not because it was warm, but because it was certain. The tunnel never failed. Its strength was not in resistance, but in humility. It did not stand tall. It did not challenge the wind. It accepted the storm and worked beneath it. While buildings shook and trees snapped, the tunnel endured by remaining small. By the 5th day, the storm finally broke. Not dramatically, not cleanly. The wind softened. Snow fell straight down again. Shapes returned to the world slowly, as if unsure they were welcome. The valley reappeared like a scar. People emerged cautiously, counting who remained. Too many were gone. Those who survived carried the knowledge quietly. They did not celebrate. They did not speak loudly. They stood in the snow and stared at the ridge, at the small, unimpressive structure that had saved lives without asking for attention. When the sun finally returned, it revealed the damage. Houses half buried, roofs bowed, fences snapped like twigs. Paths that once connected neighbors now led nowhere, and scattered across the valley, frozen shapes that would not move again. No one laughed anymore. They climbed the ridge together when the snow hardened enough to walk safely. Men who once mocked now stood silent. Women who had whispered now listened carefully. Children stared at the tunnel with the seriousness of those who understood consequences. The widow stood apart, her daughter beside her, the dog leaning against her leg. They asked questions. Why was it low? Why did it bend? Why didn't it collapse? She answered simply. Because storms don't care how brave you are, she said. They care how prepared you are. She explained how whiteout erased direction before it took warmth, how panic stood people up when staying low would have saved them, how the tunnel gave hands something to trust when eyes failed. No one argued. They helped her reinforce it for the rest of winter, made it stronger, added markers, extended it. What had once been ridiculous became necessary. Spring came slowly. Snow retreated grudgingly, revealing mud and damage beneath. The valley smelled of wet earth and loss. People rebuilt quietly, measuring twice, questioning habits they once defended without thought. The tunnel was dismantled carefully. Canvas folded. Poles stacked. Nothing wasted. It would return next winter. On the ridge, the widow planted a small garden where the tunnel had rested. The soil there was firm, protected, untouched by drift and collapse. Things grew easily. People noticed. They noticed that preparation did not make her fearful. It made her calm. They noticed that her daughter played freely now, unafraid of storms. They noticed the dog still slept near the door when the wind rose, even in summer. The story spread beyond the valley, not as legend but as lesson. Not about tunnels, about humility. About accepting that nature does not announce its intentions clearly, and that survival often belongs to those willing to look foolish early rather than heroic too late. The widow never corrected anyone who told the story wrong. She didn't need credit. She had what mattered. When the first snow of the next winter fell, no one laughed. They measured distances. They planned paths. They built low, bent structures that hugged the ground instead of challenging the sky. And when the wind came again, fewer voices were lost. If this story made you think differently about preparation, resilience, or the quiet decisions that save lives, take a moment to subscribe. Stories like this remind us that survival often belongs to those willing to be misunderstood first.